Hello friends, Matt here with Donec Requiescat. This is the next video where I'm critiquing Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and today we're going to be taking on Chapter 4, where Dawkins presents his argument for why there almost certainly is no God. Before I get into it, I want to invite you to subscribe, to like this video, and to check out my books, A Fool's Errand, and also The Wise Guy and the Fool will be coming out soon. So check those out. All right. Dawkins admits that there's probably no way to disprove God completely. Right, in Chapter 3, he goes through the various arguments for the existence of God as far as he's aware of them, and he really doesn't understand them. You can look at my other videos. I did 2 videos on Chapter 3 critiquing his critiques of the arguments for God. But in this video, he really focuses on the idea of evolution and how by small increments over time you can get these big changes, and so you don't need God to explain these, what we perceive as these big gaps. And so since you don't need God, there probably is no God, etc. And let me say that I personally agree that biological complexity is not a good argument for the existence of God. I think it's some interesting evidence, but I don't think that by itself proves that there is a God, or even is necessarily a good argument. There are other, much more convincing arguments, I think, and I even made a video, 5 reasons why I personally believe in God, reasons that I can't get rid of in my head when I am tempted to doubt the existence of God. And here's a quote from Lawrence Principe, again, from his course, Science and Religion, about what science can and cannot tell us. Right? Science has its limits, and when a scientist goes on to use science to talk about whether or not there is a God, he's not talking about as a scientist anymore, he's talking as a philosopher. And so he's actually crossing over into another playing field when he does that, which is fine as long as he's clear about that, and he has to operate by those rules in that new field. Werner Heisenberg, the famous physicist of the 20th century, essentially said the same thing. How the limits of science. In this chapter and in others, Dawkins talks about how natural selection was for him a consciousness raiser. It's like some new aspect of reality that opened his mind to possibilities that he hadn't thought of before, which is a really fascinating way of putting it. I know for me personally, beginning to study philosophy was a consciousness raiser. In particular, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas raised my consciousness to thinking about aspects of being, the very nature of existence itself, in ways that I had never thought of before, and totally illuminated everything. And Dawkins keeps coming back to this and saying that, all anybody needs is to have their consciousness raised by the possibilities of natural selection, and then they'll see that there is no God, there's no need for a God, which is an interesting kind of argument. It's not even really an argument, it's sort of red herring. He says, natural selection not only explains the whole of life, it also raises our consciousness to the power of science to explain how organized complexity can emerge from simply beginning without any deliberate guidance. He says that he's surprised at theists who accept evolution, but then say that it was God's way. And then he ridicules the idea and says, well, God must be either lazy or an underachiever. Because he uses evolution and not just doing it directly himself, he's lazy because of that. That's kind of like ridiculing a carpenter for using his tools to build a chair instead of just, doing it with his own bare hands. And again, it's not an argument, it's just ridicule. The problem is, though, again, the ridicule gets into us. It gets into us psychologically and makes us tend to doubt. And there's not even a good argument there. The ridicule is unproductive, and it blinds the reader to the good logic that's out there. Again, Lawrence Principe warning people against this type of dismissive disdain and these types of arguments. Dawkins points out that chance itself is not the cause. Chance doesn't cause anything. It's natural selection that causes things. And he says that any appeal to intelligent design begs the question about an intelligent designer who is more complex than the complex things that he has made. Here's a quote from the book. He says, the designer himself immediately raises the bigger problem of his own origin, Where, in other words, where did the designer come from? Any entity capable of intelligently designing something as improbable as a Dutchman's pipe or a universe would have to be more improbable than a Dutchman's pipe. Far from terminating the vicious regress, God aggravates it with a vengeance. First of all, he's not understanding the God that we talk about in high-end theology. In high-end theology, we talk about the simplicity of God and how a simple thing can have an array of causes. And that is evidence of the greatness of that thing. It was in this kind of point that studying the theology and the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and the other great theologians I've encountered that raised my consciousness to think about metaphysics, to think about this other level of reality, right, the nature of existence, instead of just thinking about it in terms of these complex causes, physical causes, that there's an even more fundamental underlying nature, and how you can have a complex universe come from a more simple beginning. And in particular, my consciousness was raised to the limits of science, right? To the domain of science, to seeing science as a particular domain, as well as philosophy, theology, mathematics, history, and these other disciplines. Again, here's another quote from Principe, where he's talking about this type of high-end theology that I'm afraid to say Dawkins completely misses out on. Here's a passage from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is public. You can find this. This isn't any secret teaching. And in particular, where it talks about the simplicity of God. In the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas, question 3, 8 articles talking about the simplicity of God. It's all laid out very clearly there. St. Francis de Sales is talking about God, this one act of existence with the many effects that we see. So again, the simplicity of God coming through in the writing of this great theologian. And it's only our own limitations that force us to try to understand God as a complex thing. Later in the chapter, he criticizes the way that some theologians discuss simplicity. One who says that God could be indivisible, but internally complex. But this doesn't really make sense. God is not spatial. It's not like there's an inside and an outside to God. Like outside, you can't take them apart, but on his inside, you can, and it's hard to understand then what is the metaphor that the theologian is using, especially as it's portrayed through Dawkins. But it misses out on this high-end theology, going back to these great theologians of the early church, the Middle Ages, and even contemporary teaching today. Frederick Copleston, famous historian of philosophy and philosopher himself, says that failure to understand the use of Aquinas' technical terms leads naturally to misinterpretation of his doctrine. And that's certainly what's happening here. We don't understand what Aquinas is talking about when he says simplicity, and so we completely misunderstand the rest of what he's trying to say. Again, Principe, talking about this high-end theology, right? It's complicated. It's not a simple thing to understand. It takes work to be able to understand it. The real issue also is not that complex things come from more complex things, but that complex things do come from simpler things. He then reduces the biological argument for God from complexity to really the same reason that he rejects God. He says the logic turns out to be no more convincing than this. I, insert own name, am personally unable to think of any way in which insert biological phenomenon could have been built up step by step. Therefore, it is irreducibly complex. Then he says the theist's answer is deeply unsatisfying because it leaves the existence of God unexplained. So he's saying that the people who accept the existence of God because of biological complexity, they don't understand how that can make sense, so they put God in. Dawkins is rejecting it for the same reason. He says it doesn't make sense. He doesn't understand how there could be this thing at the beginning, this origin of all the complexity, and so he rejects it. Right? So it's a similar kind of thing. We don't understand, and so we either insert or we take something away. And either way, that's not a good argument. In other words, Dawkins perceives in God this gap, and so he rejects it. And it's the same type of biological gap that some people see, that they argue for the existence of God. So are gaps a reason for an argument or not? In this chapter, I was also surprised that he takes a shot at some physicists who talk about the order in the universe and the complexity, and he basically says, well, they don't understand natural selection, so once they have their consciousness raised by that, then it'll make sense. And I was surprised by that, personally, having studied physics, and I teach physics and I read a lot of books about physics, that he would be so bold to take that kind of argument. What it looks like to me is that Dawkins has consciousness raised by Darwinian natural selection up to a certain point, but now he can't see anything past that. It's like he's put on natural selection goggles and he sees everything through those lenses. So everywhere he looks, he sees natural selection. He even has this type of lens when he talks about logic. Like, for example, when he talked about Bertrand Russell and how Bertrand Russell talked about a sound argument as opposed to a probable argument. Probability doesn't even apply to that type of logic. So in general, it looks like he says it's a challenge to explain complex things, but appealing to God does not get the job done, because this God can't exist, he's too complex, something along those lines. And then he says, but natural selection is able to get the job done, not God, so therefore it's very likely that there is no God. However, there's an entire point here that he's missed out on. A number of points, actually. First of all, the existence of the universe itself and how ordered it is. Natural selection is not a thing, it's a process. He doesn't address the issue of where do the things themselves come from in the first place. Another issue, life, goes beyond mere physical interactions. It's not something that can be explained merely in terms of, collisions of atoms and exchange of energy. And then also, our intelligence. Right? The purloined letter here, the very, very obvious, it's hidden in plain sight. Our own ability to understand, which he misses out on. That in my mind is a huge issue that he doesn't even discuss. And something that can't be explained merely in terms of natural selection. For the rest of this video now, I'm going to give you some quotes from some various sources about these main points that I think Dawkins has completely missed out on in this chapter. And I think would have to be considered in trying to refute the existence of God. So I hope you enjoy the rest of these quotes. I hope you take the time to read them. Again, please subscribe, share this video with your friends, and I'll see you soon.